Imagine a room filled with cigar smoke and the smell of stale whiskey. It is late at night in the Kremlin. Two old men are sitting across a table. They are arguably the two most powerful men in the world at that moment. One is Winston Churchill, and the other is Joseph Stalin. They are not discussing military strategy or the movement of tanks. They are discussing human beings, millions of them. Churchill pulls a scrap of paper from his pocket. It is just a small half-sheet. He scribbles a list of countries on it. Next to the name Romania, he writes 90%. Next to Greece, he writes 90%. He pushes the paper across the table. Stalin looks at it, takes a puff of his pipe, and makes a large blue tick mark on the paper. And just like that, the fate of Eastern Europe is sealed. Entire nations are sold into dictatorship on a napkin. We are taught that the Second World War was a crusade for freedom. We are told that the Allies fought to liberate the small nations of Europe from the tyranny of Nazi Germany. We believe in the Atlantic Charter, which promised self-determination to all peoples. But the events of October 9th, 1944, prove that these were just pretty words. When the doors were closed and the cameras were off, the leaders of the free world were just as cynical and ruthless as the empires of the past. They treated independent nations like poker chips to be traded late at night over a drink. To understand the magnitude of this betrayal, we have to look at the context of 1944. The war was turning. The Nazi war machine was broken. The Red Army was surging westward like a tidal wave. They had already entered Poland. They were pushing into the Balkans. In London, Winston Churchill was watching the map with growing terror. He knew that wherever the Red Army put its boots, it would stay. He saw the Soviet Union not just as an ally against Hitler, but as a new Russian empire that was about to swallow half of Europe. Churchill was a realist. He knew he could not stop the Soviet advance militarily. The British Army was exhausted. The Americans were focused on reaching Berlin and ending the war quickly. They had no interest in starting a new war with Stalin over the Balkans. So Churchill decided to make a deal with the devil. He flew to Moscow in October 1944. His goal was to save what he could of the British Empire's interests. And for Churchill, the British Empire meant the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean was the lifeline to India and the Suez Canal. It was the highway of the empire. Churchill was terrified that if the Soviets took Greece, they would have access to the Mediterranean Sea. They would threaten the Suez Canal. They would cut the artery of the British Empire. So he went to Moscow with a specific trade in mind. He would give Stalin a free hand in Eastern Europe in exchange for a free hand in Greece. The meeting took place in the Kremlin. The atmosphere was strange. These men had been allies by necessity, but they were ideological enemies. Churchill had spent his early career trying to crush the Bolshevik Revolution. Stalin was a communist dictator who had purged millions of his own people. But on this night, they were just two emperors dividing the spoils. There were no lawyers present. There were no representatives from the countries being discussed. There was no Hungarian prime minister, no Romanian king, no Greek diplomat. Their future was being decided without them. Churchill described the moment in his own memoirs. He wrote that the moment was apt for business. He said to Stalin, "Let us settle about our affairs in the Balkans. Your armies are in Romania and Bulgaria. We have interests, missions, and agents there. Don't let us get at cross purposes in small ways. So far as Britain and Russia are concerned, how would it do for you to have 90% predominance in Romania, for us to have 90% of the say in Greece, and go 50-50 about Yugoslavia?" While his translation was being listened to, Churchill wrote the figures on a scrap of paper. Romania, Russia, 90%. The others, 10%. Greece, Great Britain, 90%. Russia, 10%. Yugoslavia, 50-50. Hungary, 50-50. Bulgaria, Russia, 75%. The others, 25%. He pushed the paper across the table to Stalin. Stalin didn't say a word. He didn't negotiate. He didn't ask for more. He simply took his blue pencil and made a large tick upon it and passed it back. The silence in the room was heavy. Churchill suddenly felt a pang of guilt. He realized how cynical this looked. He realized that if the world saw this paper, they would be horrified. He said to Stalin, "Might it not be thought rather cynical if it seemed we had disposed of these issues so fateful to millions of people in such an offhand manner? Let us burn the paper." Stalin advised him against it. "No, you keep it." Churchill folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He later called it his naughty document. Think about that phrase. Naughty. It is a word a child uses when they steal a cookie. Churchill used it to describe condemning millions of people to decades of totalitarian rule. It reveals a terrifying detachment. To these men, nations were not collections of families and histories and dreams. They were just percentages on a ledger. But what did these percentages actually mean in the real world? Let's look at the 90% for Russia and Romania. Romania had been an ally of Germany but had switched sides in 1944. The young King Michael had launched a brave coup against the pro-Nazi dictator Antonescu. He had welcomed the Soviets as liberators. He thought that by joining the Allies, he was saving his country's independence. He didn't know that Churchill had already sold him. Because of the percentages agreement, the British and Americans stood back and did nothing as the Soviets dismantled the Romanian state. When the Soviet representatives arrived in Bucharest, they didn't just advise, they dictated. They used the 90% figure as a license to do whatever they wanted. They orchestrated the appointment of a communist government. They rigged the elections of 1946. When the Romanian opposition parties tried to protest, they looked to London and Washington for help. They sent desperate telegrams. They reminded the British of the Atlantic Charter. They said, "We are fighting for democracy, help us." The British Foreign Office ignored them. They couldn't help. They had a deal. The result was the abdication of King Michael and 40 years of brutal dictatorship under Ceausescu. The prisons of Romania were filled with the intellectuals and the patriots who had believed in Western freedom. They died in the gulags while Churchill sat in London with his naughty document in his pocket. Now let's look at the other side of the trade, the 90% for Britain and Greece. This is the part of the story that is often left out. We tend to think that the deal was bad because it gave power to Stalin. But the deal was also brutal because of what Churchill did with his 90%. Greece had been occupied by the Nazis. The resistance movement against the Nazis was led largely by the communists, the group known as EAM Ellis. They were the ones who had fought in the mountains. They were the ones who had blown up the bridges. They were heroes to the Greek people. When the Germans retreated in 1944, the Greeks expected liberation. They expected to choose their own government. But Churchill didn't care about what the Greeks wanted. He cared about the British Empire. He wanted the King of Greece back on the throne because the king was a British puppet. So when the British army arrived in Athens, they didn't come to liberate, they came to occupy. On December 3rd, 1944, a massive demonstration took place in Syntagma Square in Athens. It was a peaceful protest by the resistance fighters and the civilians. They were calling for a government of national unity. The police who had served under the Nazis and were now serving under the British opened fire on the crowd. 28 civilians were killed, hundreds were wounded. This triggered the Decembriana, the events of December. It was the beginning of the Greek Civil War. Churchill was furious. He ordered the British general roughly to hold Athens as if he were in a conquered city against a local rebellion. Think about that. He ordered his general to treat the capital of an ally like a conquered enemy city. The British army, which had just finished fighting the Nazis, began fighting the anti-Nazi resistance. They used tanks and aircraft to strafe the neighborhoods of Athens. And what did Stalin do? This is the most cynical part of the whole story. The great communists sent desperate messages to Moscow. They begged for help. They asked Stalin to send weapons. They asked for support against the British imperialists. Stalin did nothing. He had given his word. Greece was 90% British. He respected the tick mark on the napkin. He let the Greek communists be slaughtered by the British army because he wanted to keep his prize in Romania and Bulgaria. It was honor among thieves. The Greek Civil War dragged on for years. It was a bloodbath. It tore the country apart. It led to a right-wing authoritarian regime that lasted for decades. This was the price of Churchill's napkin. And what about the 50-50 split in Yugoslavia? That turned out to be the most complicated one. Stalin and Churchill thought they could share influence over Tito, the Yugoslav partisan leader, but Tito refused to be a percentage point. He refused to be owned by London or Moscow. He eventually broke with Stalin and forged his own path. It was the only place where the human spirit defied the arithmetic of the great powers, but elsewhere the math held. In Bulgaria, the 75-25 split quickly became 100-0. The Soviets executed the entire Regency Council. They purged the non-communist politicians. Britain sent a few mild notes of protest, but they knew the game was up. In Hungary, the 50-50 split was a tragedy. For a while, there was a semblance of democracy. There were free elections in 1945, where the communists lost. But slowly, methodically, the Soviets used their military presence to slice away the democracy. It was called salami tactics, slice by slice until nothing was left. By 1947, the 50-50 was gone. Hungary was a satellite state. The percentages agreement is the smoking gun of the Cold War. It proves that the division of Europe was not an accident. It was not just a result of where the armies stopped. It was a premeditated partition. It strips away the moral high ground of the Allies. We like to judge the pact between Hitler and Stalin in 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as the ultimate evil. And it was. They carved up Poland. But how different was the Churchill-Stalin Pact of 1944? They carved up the Balkans. The only difference was that Churchill was one of the good guys. This document remained secret for a long time. It wasn't published until Churchill wrote his memoirs in the 1950s. By then, the Iron Curtain had fallen. The Cold War was in full freeze. Churchill was giving speeches about the tyranny of the Soviet Union. He was coining phrases like the Iron Curtain. But he was the one who had helped pull the curtain down. He had legitimized the Soviet sphere of influence before the war even ended. He had signaled to Stalin that the West would not fight for Eastern Europe. Some historians argue that Churchill had no choice. They say that the Red Army was already there. They say that you cannot argue with geography. They say that by making the deal, he at least saved Greece and saved the Mediterranean. That is the realpolitik defense, and there is truth to it. Churchill was playing a weak hand. Britain was bankrupt and exhausted. He was trying to salvage something from the wreckage, but the moral cost was devastating. It meant that for 50 years, millions of Europeans lived in fear. It meant that the secret police in Bucharest and Sofia and Budapest had a free hand. It meant that the ideals of the war, the fight against tyranny, the fight for self-determination, were exposed as lies. It teaches us a dark lesson about how the world really works. We watch the news today and we see summits, we see the G7, we see the UN Security Council, we see leaders shaking hands and smiling for the cameras, and we think that international law matters. We think that sovereignty matters. But the story of the napkin tells us that behind the curtain in the smoke-filled rooms, the old rules still apply. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. When the great powers meet, they are not discussing justice. They are discussing percentages. They are discussing spheres of influence. They are looking at a map and deciding who gets what. In 1944, it was Romania and Greece. Today, it might be Ukraine or Syria or Taiwan. The names change, but the game remains the same. The scary thing about the naughty document is how casual it was. It wasn't a formal treaty printed on vellum with wax seals. It was a scribble. It shows us how fragile our lives really are. We go to work, we raise our families, we vote in our elections. We think we are in control of our destiny. But somewhere in a capital city far away, two old men might be sitting, drinking whiskey and deciding that our country is now 90% theirs. Churchill wanted to burn the paper because he knew it was shameful. He knew that it violated everything he publicly stood for, but he kept it. And Stalin kept his copy, because they both knew that this scrap of paper was more real than any constitution or any charter of human rights. It was the raw currency of power. The percentages agreement is a reminder that empires do not have friends. They have interests, and when those interests align or when they collide, the little nations get crushed in the middle. We celebrate Churchill for his refusal to surrender to Hitler. We celebrate him for his speeches on the beaches. But we must also remember him in that room in Moscow. The man who looked at a list of nations and decided that 90% was a good price for clean conscience. He saved the empire for a few more years. He kept the Mediterranean open. But he lost the soul of the war. When the Greek students were shot in Athens and the Romanian intellectuals were frozen in the Gulag, they were the victims of that blue tick mark. History is complex. It is not black and white. It is gray. And sometimes it is written in blue pencil on a dirty napkin. This is Tom from the Collapse Log. We like to believe that history is shaped by great forces and grand ideals. But sometimes the map of the world is drawn by two tired men who just want to finish their drink and go to bed. The tragedy is that we are the ones who have to wake up in the world they designed.